What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Canadian Football Fantasy Fix. I'm Ryan Coop here with your 2021 CFL Fantasy Year in Review. Yes, so one final time this year, taking a look back at the 2021 CFL Fantasy season. We're going to take a look through the top performers, the biggest letdowns, and the best surprises from the fantasy perspective of the CFL season. Here today. I originally framed this video and teased it as kind of a CFL Fantasy Awards show in preparation for it. It's not going to be quite that same format. It's going to be a bit more of a general year in review, I think, will be a better encapsulation of all of the data we have here. So we're going to take a look through all of this today to wrap up the 2021 season. If you missed it, I did put out earlier a couple weeks ago an update on my plans for the offseason. And starting in January, you can look forward to every Friday still having a video throughout the offseason. Next week, we'll be taking a look through rounding up the latest news from around the CFL. Since the Grey Cup ended. So should be a good start to the new year with that. But first, let's take a look back to the 2021 season and kick off the 2021 CFL Fantasy Year in Review. And let's start off with the quarterback position as we did, each week as we were previewing the matchups for the weeks. Let's start off with the quarterbacks and take a look. Here are your top quarterback performances for this season. In terms of overall fantasy points, it was Cody Fajardo of the Saskatchewan Roughriders leading the way with 219.6. Michael Riley of the BC Lions just behind him at 218.9. And then Zach Collaros, the MOP of the CFL, 201.8 points. A very good season for him. And, he managed to stay healthy all season long, put up solid production throughout the season, and paid off in big ways in CFL Fantasy most of the year. All three of these guys, really. In terms of average points per start, the leader there was Vernon Adams Jr. of the Montreal Alouettes. He was putting up 18.2 fantasy points per game before he did unfortunately go down to injury. And you have to think if he could have played the full season long, he would be near, if not at the top of the overall charts. Cody Fajardo, 16.9 points per start for him. Was the second highest among quarterbacks who started at least 4 games. And then it was a tie between Michael Riley and Nick Arbuckle at 16.8 points. So it's a promising future here potentially for the Edmonton Elks with Nick Arbuckle signed as their quarterback. In the couple games he played this year, I think he had 4 starts or 5 starts. He was up there in terms of fantasy points per game. So something to look forward to there. And of course, another respectable average effort there by Michael Riley. The leading quarterback average was actually Nathan Rourke of the BC Lions, who put something like 25-point average or 22-point average on the board, but only played 2 games this year. So not enough of a sample size there, in my opinion, to give him that nod, but honorable mention there. And speaking of Nathan Rourke, he had the highest single game point total among quarterbacks this season, 35.8 points in his Week 16 start against the Edmonton Elks. Trevor Harris, when he was with Edmonton before getting traded to Montreal, put up a 33.3 point day against the Calgary Stampeders in Week 5. And sticking with Week 5, Vernon Adams Jr., the third highest single game total, as he put up 31 points against Ottawa. Now we take a look at the biggest letdowns and the best surprises. With each position, we're going to start with the letdowns, and then we're going to go into the surprises, because we want to leave the negative side of things in the past and then move on forward with the positive side of things, especially going into the new year here as we wrap up 2021. So let's take a look, first of all, at the biggest letdowns at quarterback. And number 3 for me is Matt Nichols of the Ottawa Red Blacks. He had just 5 starts this year, 3.6 points per game he started. Not what you are looking for from a starting quarterback. I know Matt Nichols has generally, been a quarterback that's not been a fantasy barn burner, so to say, even in his time in Winnipeg. Is more of a steady production guy, don't turn the ball over. Game manager is the label on him a lot. But still, you expect him to come in as a starting quarterback, and you expect an average of greater than 3.6 points a game. So big disappointment there. He was a real cheap salary, fantasy-wise, most of the time he was in, and so was a potential value play, but his average kind of took that away in the final couple of games he played there, where that wasn't even, a feasible option necessarily. So bit of a letdown there from Matt Nichols, and of course then the injury making him miss the rest of the season there. The number 2 biggest letdown to me at the quarterback position was Trevor Harris. Started the season with Edmonton, finished it with Montreal, had 6 starts with the Elks, and in those 6 starts, 5 of them he put up under 15 fantasy points, 3 of them were under 10 fantasy points. Struggled to put touchdowns on the board. Ended up eventually getting traded to Montreal. The Elks decided to move on from him, and to his credit, he did have some good games down the stretch when he was with the Alouettes, and kind of, had a strong finish to the year where he was putting up games over 15 points there. But the start to the year is the biggest letdown for me, because I had high hopes for the Elks offense. They brought in Darrell Walker, they brought in Armani Edwards, among others, to help that passing game even more. And I was expecting big things. Trevor Harris, I had a season-long fantasy draft. He was the first quarterback I took off the board. And big letdown there to have such a great quarterback underwhelm and end up getting traded away from the team. So that was a big letdown. Was Trevor Harris in his time with Edmonton. And the number 1 letdown at the quarterback position fantasy-wise for 2021 has to be Bo Levi-Mitchell of the Calgary Stampeders. This is a guy who is one of the best quarterbacks we have seen in a very long time. Has consistently, been a top quarterback in the game year after year throughout his career here. But this season, 11 starts for him, and only a 10.9 points per game average for Bo Levi-Mitchell, which is certainly not what you're looking for from one of the top quarterbacks in the game. He 24th best average, 18th best average, I think it was, among quarterbacks this year in terms of fantasy points. The only quarterbacks who started games that had less than him were Sean McGuire, Duck Hodges, Taron Christian, Matt Nichols, and Isaac Harker, who all played a little bit of football there, but nothing major. So big disappointment for Bo Levi-Mitchell this year, absolutely. Only 2 games over 15 points. I really hope we see a bounce back from Bo coming into 2022. Now we take a look at the best surprises at the quarterback position, because there were some gems this year. And number 3 is Nathan Rourke of the BC Lions. I talked about him already, having one of the higher averages. 2 starts this year, week 1 versus Saskatchewan, put up 12.8 points, and that was in kind of, a half and a bit of football. Week 16, before Michael O'Reilly came in and in the second half in that wild quarterback switcheroo situation. And then he got the start in the final week of the season. Yes, he was playing an Edmonton team that must have been exhausted, but he put up 35.8 points. Nathan Rourke, a great surprise here. Canadian quarterback. We love those here in the CFL. And really kind of, showed that he has a potential bright future ahead of him here. Michael Riley, how much longer is he going to be playing? Is Rourke the future starter here in BC? Does he have the capability to be a starter somewhere else going forward? That remains to be seen as we get on through the offseason here, but definitely a nice surprise to see a Canadian quarterback putting up numbers such as the Rourke did in Week 16. Number 2 best surprise for me was Jake Mayer of the Stampeders. 3 starts when Bo Levi-Mitchell went down. Nothing spectacular fantasy point-wise in those 3 games in between weeks 3 and 5, but steady production there from Jake Mayer. He had 300 yards plus passing in all 3 of those games, and it kind of seems like Calgary has done it again and found a gem of a backup quarterback that could be primed, for a starting job somewhere, if not next year, maybe the year after. With another year under his belt. So much like Nathan Work, great year for Jake Maier. Gets in for a couple of starts and produces and shows a bit of potential there, and could be a guy we see as a starter in the league going forward at some point. And then the number one best surprise to me this year has to be Zach Collaros of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and it's mostly because of that first statistic there, the 13 starts. Collaros is a guy who has been, had so many injury troubles, was at the peak of his game, I want to say back in 2014, 2015, was at the peak of his game. Then the injuries really, took a toll on his career there for a little while. Missed most of the 2019 season, came back in late, joined the Bombers, went on that run and gave them the Grey Cup. And then coming into this year, I didn't know what to expect from Collaros, but he delivered. He stayed healthy all season, 13 starts. The only one he didn't play was because it was the game didn't matter at that point late in the season, so they gave him a rest. Put up the third highest total fantasy points among quarterbacks, averaged 15.5 points a game, and was very consistent in the full games he played. Not counting Week 16 against Calgary when he only played about a quarter. Only one game under 10 points, and it was right, I think, at like 9.4 or something like that. So a very consistent year from Collaros. He didn't necessarily light the lamp, so to say, in terms of massive performances. He had one or two over 20, I think that was it. But consistency was there for Collaros all season long. You knew what you were going to get from him, and he delivered it over and over. So a nice surprise there from the most outstanding player. Now we move on to the running back position and take a look at the top players there. In terms of overall point totals, Kadeem Carey of the Calgary Stampeders leading the way at 174.3. And then William Stanback at 163, William Powell at 159.2, round out the top three there. So great season by Kadeem Carey, capturing the top overall total. In terms of average points per game, it was Andrew Harris leading the way. He averaged 15.6 fantasy points per game. Only played, 7 or 8 games this year because of his injuries, unfortunately. But when he was in the lineup, he was delivering. Not necessarily, given his price point in CFL Fantasy. That's a different story. But in terms of overall points per game, Andrew Harris was the leader there by a couple of points. William Stanback capturing the second spot in that category as well at 13.6. And Don Jackson, 13.5 points a game. Only played 4 games in the regular season with the Ticats, but in those games down the stretch, he was one of the top go-to options at the running back position, and became a force for that running game there for the Ticats. In terms of top single game performances, Andrew Harris led the way with a 30.4 point effort against the Elks in week number 10. William Stanback put up 26.3 against the Argos in week number 12, and then we have a tie for third place between the Stanback week 8 against Toronto, putting up 25.4. A couple massive performances against the Argos for William Stanback. 2 games there, both over 25 points. And DJ Foster of the Argos putting up 25.4 in a massive game against the Red Blacks in week number 10. Starting off with the biggest letdowns at the running back position before we take a look at the positives here and the best surprises. Number 3, Sean Thomas Erlington of the Hamilton Tiger Cats. 12 games this year, 8.5 fantasy points a game for him. His best game of the season was 14.9. I was high on Sean Thomas Erlington coming into this season. I expected him starting running back there in Hamilton. He had a strong couple of games back in 2019 before he did miss most of the season due to injury, and I was expecting him to be able to continue carrying that forward this year. He did have some decent games there, but his usage was very minimal. They rotated other running backs in like Malik Irons and Jackson Bennett. He ended up losing the starting job to Don Jackson down the stretch. I thought Sean Thomas Erlington had the potential to be the next top Canadian running back in the CFL, and I think he's still a solid running back and has potential here. But his production levels from fantasy perspective this year were a disappointment and often made him a red light option in terms of fantasy picks. The number 2 biggest letdown, Shaq Cooper of the BC Lions, ended up being released after just 5 games with them. Just 7.6 fantasy points a game when he was with BC. Ended up going over to Winnipeg. Got in, in a return role a couple games down the stretch, which did not go very well either. But big disappointment here. If you watch the positional previews the first couple of weeks of this season, all of the time, I was hyping up Shaq Cooper. I was very excited to see what he could do, and he just wasn't getting the ball in BC at all early in the season. It's hard to put the point totals up if you're not getting the carries, and so Shaq Cooper, minimal usage there, didn't get much done with it. I was looking forward to big things from him this year after a small sample size in Edmonton, and that just wasn't there. So I'm interested to see where his career goes from here. Does he get in as a starter or as a backup role somewhere in the CFL this offseason? That remains to be seen. But definitely a letdown to go from one of the pieces I was most looking forward to seeing this year in a starting role and being released a couple of games later. And then the number 1 biggest letdown fantasy-wise is John White of the Toronto Argonauts. This is a guy who's been a 1,000-yard running back. You expected big things going over to that Argos offense that had, a decent amount of firepower there. I figured, whether it's Nick Arbuckle, McLeod, Bethel Thompson, John White's a guy you could lean on. But 10 games this year, just 7.9 fantasy points a game. Only 2 of those games did he hit over the 10-point mark. It seemed, the usage just wasn't there as expected as it was for him this season. DJ Foster ended up coming in and taking over, about half the reps at least, and at times actually took over the starting running back job. John White, price-wise in fantasy, was, for a good chunk of the season still pretty high priced, and did not warrant putting in your lineup more often than not, just because of that and because of the minimal usage. So a bit of a letdown season there for one John White. Now we take a look at the best surprises at running back. The number 3 one for me is Kadeem Carey of the Calgary Stampeders. Had the highest fantasy total on the season. 13 games, 13.4 points a game for him fantasy-wise, which was best, 4th best among running backs in the CFL. Led the league in rushing touchdowns. He had 7 on the year. The next highest among running backs was 4. And led all running back, or was second in the league in rushing yards behind only William Stanback. A great season for Kadeem Carey. He played a couple of games back in 2019. Got in there, but Don Jackson was kind of the lead back in the mix. Got himself, was the starting running back this year. Stayed healthy all season long pretty much. And really had himself a very fine season. And a Calgary team that more often than not, in the past number of years, we've been accustomed to seeing be a pass-heavy team with Bo Levi Mitchell at the helm. Well, Kadeem Carey kind of was the leader on the offense there this season. So a nice surprise there for him to have a very nice season. I'm excited to see how he follows that up in 2022. The number 2 best surprise, DJ Foster of the Toronto Argonauts. 10 games this year, 12.4 points a game, which was 6th best among running backs in the CFL. And that includes, most of these games he was in kind of as a backup, kind of, timeshare situation. Imagine what he could have done if he was the starter all season long. And he led all running backs in receiving yards. He didn't get too much yardage down on the ground. I think around 300 yards there. But over 300 yards through the air this season. That's what you love to see in a fantasy running back. A guy who can catch the ball and make plays there, because receptions are worth points for you. And so DJ Foster, great season for him coming in as a backup, and implemented that interesting dual back system in Toronto. And whether it's with the Argos or whether it's with a different team, I'm not 100% sure on his current contract status. I think Foster has a place in the CFL and is a really interesting tool for teams to use if they want to get creative on offense, the way you can deploy him, as a running back, as a receiver, etc. So a nice surprise there, DJ Foster for the Argos. And the number one best surprise, James Butler of the BC Lions. 11 games this year, 13.3 fantasy points a game, 5th best in the CFL. Coming into the season, it was expected Shaq Cooper was going to kind of be your go-to running back there, but he was not quite ready to go at the start of the season, I believe. So Butler got the start, had a good first game of the season, made enough of an impact that he ended up, Cooper did get in for a few games, but then Butler came back in, stole the starting job in BC, and really had a strong finish down the stretch. The Lions went from a team where don't pick a running back because they're not getting the ball to, in the latter portions of the season, it almost became Butler is a must start at running back. Final 3 weeks of the regular season, he put up the top score among running backs in each of those. So a very nice surprise for Butler in BC this season. Now we take a look at the wide receivers. There's a lot of them, so a lot to talk about here. But in terms of the top 3 totals, overall, Eugene Lewis of the Alouettes led the way at 213. Jake Weineke at 204. So a couple of Montreal Alouettes at the top of the charts there. And the only 1,000-yard receiver in the CFL, Kenny Lawler, finishing with 202.2 fantasy points, 3rd highest overall. Among receivers who played at least 4 games, the highest average was Lucky Whitehead of the BC Lions, 16.8 points per game. Eugene Lewis had 16.4, and Kenny Lawler with 15.6. In terms of highest single game performances, we had that monster Week 9 game for Kenny Lawler against the BC Lions. 38.5 points in that one, over 200 yards. I think he had 2 touchdowns in there as well. Massive game there, highest total among anybody all season. Eugene Lewis, 34.6 against Toronto in week number 12. And then Kamar Jordan against the Edmonton Elks in week number 6, putting up 33.9 points. So a couple huge performances there from some receivers this season. In terms of the biggest letdowns, I messed up the chart there, so you can see number 2 and number 1 already there. I guess I messed up the animation on the presentation, but hey, that can, technical difficulties and whatnot. But I've got top 5 for letdowns and surprises at receiver in the CFL this season, because there's so many to choose from. And I had a hard time narrowing it down to 3. Heck, I had a hard time even narrowing it down to 5. So anyways, we'll come back to the 2 there at the bottom. Just pretend you don't see those there just quite yet. Now let's start off at number 5. Hergy Mayala of the Calgary Stampeders. I had some high hopes for him this year. Strong finish to 2019 for him, and expected them to have a good season this year in a starting role for Calgary. 13 games though this year, 4.4 points a game for him, 67th best among receivers in the CFL, and 0 games above 10 points. He was basically a fantasy afterthought this season, which was a bit disappointing to see from a young receiver. I was hoping to see a ton of growth from. Bit of a disappointment there for Hergy Mayala. Number 4, Brandon Banks of the Hamilton Tiger Cats. 10 games this year, 11.8 points a game, 17th best in the CFL, and only 2 games above 15 points. Banks is the guy that you expect to be, first through third in terms of fantasy points in the CFL. His price was through the roof in fantasy all season long. It did eventually drop a little bit down the stretch, but over $10,000, you're expecting performances of 25, 30 points out of him. While only 2 games above 15 and an 11.8 point average, basically made it so all season long Banks was not a guy you put in your lineup because it just wasn't worth it. So Brandon Banks, big disappointment this year, comes in at number 4 on the biggest letdowns. Number 3, Shaq Evans of the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Played 7 games this year, had I think 2 games early in the season, then went down due to injury. Took a while to come back and did play a couple more down the stretch, but 7 games, 6.8 points a game, only 54th in the CFL. 0 touchdowns after I think he had 5 the year before. And, longest catch for him was 18 yards this season. This is a guy that's been consistently throughout his career known as a deep threat. Go back to 2019, there's a handful of games there where his longest catch is 30, 40, 60 yards in each of those. The deep ball was a problem for the Riders this year, and that hurt Evans' fantasy totals there definitely, with his longest catch just being 18 yards on the season. So disappointing year for him, hampered by injuries. I would like to see a bounce back from him in 2022. And then we get into the top two here. You saw them on the screen already due to the little oopsie there. But Armani Edwards of the Elks comes in at number 2 to me. 6 games, 5.3 points per game, 62nd best in the CFL, and only 1 game above 5.5 points. It was a big free agent acquisition, was kind of the quieter one of the two. A lot of talk was Darrell Walker going back to Edmonton, but Armani Edwards, I think, had 1,000-yard receiving the year before, had a couple of other seasons of around 950 yards before that. Very solid production in Toronto before coming to Edmonton. And with that, you certainly hope for better than what you got, which was, 5 points or under most of the season this year in the few games he did get to play. So big disappointment there was Armani Edwards for me. I was expecting more out of him for Edmonton. And then Darrell Walker, number 1, 11 games, 8.8 points a game, 34th in the CFL, one of the highest paid receivers in the game, brought in back to Edmonton after spending some time with Toronto, and just seemed like there was a big disconnect. He got a fair share of targets. I think he was one of the top 5 or 6 most targeted receivers in the CFL. But it just seemed like it never was translating to anything. 7 games this year, under 10 fantasy points from. His price dropped. At one point it was, over $8,000. End of the season, I think it was under $6,000 in terms of the fantasy price. And no touchdowns for Darrell Walker this season either, which was a big letdown there for a guy that's normally able to produce a couple of touchdowns a season. Now we get into the best surprises of this year, and once again, I messed up the PowerPoint slide, copy and paste here, my bad. So we'll come back to the top 2 here at the end, but a little teaser for you there. You can look forward to me talking about those in just a couple of minutes. But number 5 best surprise at receiver this season, Curley Gittens Jr. of the Toronto Argonauts. 13 games this season, 10.3 fantasy points a game, was 25th best among receivers. Start of the year, he was in the lineup. He wasn't really getting much production. I think actually maybe week 1 he had a touchdown. Surprised a bit with 10 points, but then, a bunch of weeks in a row with nothing really. And then went on a tear to end the season. 4 of his last 5 games over the 15-point mark, was basically a lock to put in lineups down the latter portions of the season here, was Curley Gittens Jr. And, for an offense that had the likes of Eric Rogers, who was injured most of the season, but Tavares Daniels, Ricky Collins Jr., all of these great guys like that. Gittens was the go-to guy, it seemed, for McLeod Bethel Thompson near the end of the season. So a nice surprise there, a nice up-and-coming receiver here, and I'm excited to see what he can do with that in 2022. Number 4, Tim White of the Hamilton Tiger Cats. 13 games this year, 11.9 points per game, 16th best among receivers. 2 games over 20 points, and 6th in the league in receiving yards this season. Was a benefactor from Braylon Addison missing most of the season due to injury this year, and came into the lineup. Tim White was definitely preseason not a guy we were necessarily talking a ton about in terms of receivers. All the eyes in Hamilton were on Brandon Banks, they were on Braylon Addison, Jalen Acklin, the likes of that, Devere Posey, who ended up being released because guys like Tim White managed to step in the lineup. Not too often did he have the massive performances, but he was very steady. Even if it was a bit of a down week, you were getting, at least 7 points out of him. And his price rose throughout the season. It started the year, I think, at a $2,500 price, and up at the end of the season, he's in the $5,000-$6,000 range. Was Tim White? To me, that's one of the best growth among receivers in terms of this year. So kudos to him on a fantastic season in a starting role for the Ticats. Number 3, Jake Weineke, the Montreal Alouettes. 14 games this year, 14.6 points per game, 6th best in the CFL, was 5th in receiving yards, 1st in receiving touchdowns. 2019, he had 8 touchdowns that season, which was, a nice surprise in its own right. And you're thinking, okay, well, how does he follow that up this year? Well, he had a fantastic year. I think he finished with 11 touchdowns to lead the league. And at some point early in the season, when it was on such a tear of, I think, 8 touchdowns in 10 games or something like that, it seemed like he was money near the end zone. Great season for him. Really stepped up. Him and Eugene Lewis, that 1-2 punch at receiver for Montreal Alouettes by far. And great season there by Jake Weineke. Now we get into the top 2, which again you've already can see here. But Kenny Lawler of the Bombers, 13 games, 15.6 points per game, 4th best in the CFL, the only 1,000-yard receiver this season, 3rd in the league in receiving touchdowns. Kenny Lawler had himself a fine 2019 season. I think 630-ish yards is what he finished with that year. But then really stepped it up this season and was a dominant force, especially early on in the year. He did have the highest, single game total with that monster game against the Lions back in week 9, I think it was. Kenny Lawler, very nice surprise to see the guy step up and have a fine season and to continue on what he did in 2019 in fewer games this year, coming close to not quite doubling, but increasing his totals by quite a bit there. So good surprise there was Kenny Lawler, and the top best surprise at receiver, Lucky Whitehead of the formerly of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, now of the BC Lions. 12 games, 16.8 points per game, best in the CFL. 5 games over 20 points, 4th in the league in receiving yards. This guy was an explosive threat, and the Lions used him as such. How often did we see, Michael Riley to Lucky Whitehead, a screen pass that then he uses his speed and takes for a massive gain, or a deep ball that he manages to bring in for a massive gain there. Lucky Whitehead, I think, was one of the most dynamic players in the CFL this season. And, his previous season in Winnipeg in 2019, he showed flashes of that, but was kind of still minimally used in that offense. BC used him as the number 1 receiver. They have Brian Burnham there for the Lions. Lucky Whitehead was the number 1 receiver, the go-to guy, kind of supplanted him there in terms of that this season. And a massive season for him, and a bright future ahead for the speedster, Lucky Whitehead. Now we take a look at the defenses. The top overall performance this season by far was the Winnipeg Blue Bombers with 169 fantasy points. Montreal coming in at 128. Hamilton coming in at 122. The averages is the same because they all played the same number of games. The Bombers averaging 12.1 points a game. Alouettes 9.1 and Ticats 8.7. In terms of top single game performances, the Argos putting up a massive 29 points against Week 10 against Ottawa. That takes the cake there. A tie for the second highest. Montreal Week 11 against Ottawa put up 23 points. The Bombers putting up 23 against Edmonton in Week 7. And then the third, fourth, because they tied for second. The Bombers in Week 12 putting up 22 points against BC. So some big performances from defenses. Defense is a position that historically everybody shies away from in CFL Fantasy and doesn't think they produce. Yeah, that changed this year. You got some big games out of these and some reliable point totals out of some of these teams. Let's take a look at the biggest letdowns on defense here. Looks like I got the PowerPoint slides back on track, and you don't get a sneak peek on these ones. Sorry to say. But number 3 biggest letdown on defense was the BC Lions, who put up 6.2 fantasy points a game, tied for 6th in the CFL. Coming into the year, I didn't have the highest expectations for them defensively. I would have put them middle of the pack there. But they started the year really strong with 3 of their first 5 games being over 10 fantasy points. And then all of a sudden, starting to become a force. Behind the Bombers were the second or third best defense early parts of the season, but then it just trailed off down the stretch. 4 of their last 6 games ended up being under 1 point, including 2 of them in the minuses. That's just a disastrous finish for a fantasy defense, and certainly a big letdown there that they could not carry that in throughout the entire season. Number 2 biggest letdown, Calgary, also had 6.2 fantasy points per game, tied for 6th in the CFL. Calgary is a team that we're used to be seeing so dominant all season long, year after year, both offense and defense. And this year, especially early on, it seemed like that just wasn't there. They did pick it up down the stretch to their credit, but in their first 9 games, only one of them was above 5 fantasy points. Basically made them a fantasy afterthought for a bulk of the season, and finished last in the league in interceptions with only 6 in a 14-game season, which is an incredibly low number there. So a disappointing season for Calgary's defense from a fantasy point perspective. And the biggest letdown, the Edmonton Elks, 3.9 points per game, last in the CFL. Only 1 game this season above 8 points, which is kind of the bare minimum you needed to get value out of a fantasy defense. And only 2 interceptions for them in their first 7 games. So it took them quite a while to get those turnovers on the board. They weren't holding teams necessarily to low point totals either, and just weren't forcing the turnovers and weren't getting the sacks that we expected them to get this year, with a lot of talented pieces on that defense just not delivering. So those are your biggest letdowns on defense. In terms of best surprises, number 3 for me, Saskatchewan Roughriders, 8.5 fantasy points per game, 4th best in the CFL among defenses. They had 6 games above 10 points. They were 2nd in the league in sacks. They were tied for 1st in interceptions. And, why is this a surprise? Because of all of the injuries they had. The Riders were a team that had a lot of pieces, either leave to different teams or the NFL in the offseason. They had a bit of turnover there. Then they had a bunch of guys go down to injury before the season even started. They were rotating guys in throughout their lineups this season. Normally, the Riders being one of the top defenses in the CFL is not a surprise, but I think given the injuries, you got to give a nice nod to them here for the way they rallied together and still finished tops in some of these categories. Number 2 best surprise, the Montreal Alouettes, 9.1 fantasy points per game, 2nd in the CFL. They had 2 games over 20 points. They were 1st in the league in sacks, including a massive 10-sack game against Ottawa. They were tied for 1st with Saskatchewan in interceptions this season. When you think of the Montreal Alouettes, I feel like in general you think about the offensive firepower of the likes of Vernon Adams Jr., Eugene Lewis, Jake Weineke, William Stanback. The defense, I think, is one of the most underrated in the CFL. They delivered time after time this season, some big totals there, and had a very impressive year. So nice surprise there from an underrated Alouettes defense. And the number 1 best surprise, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Yes, they were one of the top defenses the year before already, but how can you not label a team that nearly broke league records for least points allowed in the 4th quarter? And I'm sure we're one of the best teams in history in some of the other categories as well. How do you not label that the best surprise? Because even if you think they're going to be good, nobody saw the type of defensive effort we saw from them this year coming in. 12.1 points per game, highest in the CFL, 3 games above 20 points. Yes, they were on the higher fantasy price range, but even then were more often than not still worth it to put in your lineup this season, and dominated game after game. So definitely nice a surprise on defense this year was just the overwhelming dominance of the Blue Bombers. So that is your 2021 CFL Fantasy Year in review. We've gone through the top performers, the biggest letdowns, and the best surprises of the season. I feel like that is a nice summary, nice encapsulation of the year. And of course, there's so many other guys we could have talked about and highlighted here. Trying to nail down that best surprise category to just the top 5 for receivers was a nightmare, because there's so many honorable mentions that you could put in all of these positions, really, but those were some of the ones that stood out the most to me. So I hope that was a good way to summarize the season. And now we say goodbye to 2021 here and start taking a look to 2022 and the new year. Again, as I mentioned off the top of the show, go back, check out my latest video on my plans for the offseason to see what's coming in January. Next week will be a roundup of the latest CFL news. I'm sure we'll spin that in a fantasy perspective, what different coaching changes, roster moves, etc. mean for fantasy production. So you can look forward to that coming out next Friday, the first Friday in January 2022. Thank you once again for a fantastic year here on the Canadian Football Fantasy Fix. A lot of fun, doing these videos, interacting with you in the comments, etc. It's been a blast. I appreciate you following along all season long. Hope everybody has had a wonderful holiday season so far. Hope you have a wonderful new year. Happy New Year's, everybody. And we'll talk to you again here in 2022. Do all the YouTube things, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't. If you have any fantasy topics you want me to discuss in the off season, put those in the comments section. We do have room in the schedule to kind of play with that a little bit and discuss different things until we get back to previewing games going forward. And yeah, put those all in the comments section. Follow me on Twitter as well, at CooperTrooper42. Link to that's in the description if you want to talk CFL Fantasy or CFL in general or anything there with me as well. I always look forward to chatting with all of you. And stay safe this New Year's season. Take care. Have a good one. Bye.